Welcome to the 84th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today my partner Dave Ingram will introduce you to risk time zones. Over several podcasts, we'll break down the risk management cycle. As Dave shared earlier, talking about pragmatism, successful risk management does not mean doing the same thing all the time. In periods of normality, boom, and bust, thinking about specific practical techniques can lead to better outcomes. And of course, emerging risks, one of my favorite topics, overlays the entire process. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Let's get started.
Every football team has a standard playbook. Those are the reliable plays that work most of the time. But no team expects to run those plays for the entire game. Late in a close game, down by a score, you need something different. 2-minute drills, trick plays, audibles at the line. Most programs, though, are built around a single playbook, and it's usually a good one. Discipline, controls, careful execution. That works well, but only in certain conditions. The argument I want to make today is that there are at least 5 other risk environments that a company can find itself in, each requiring a different set of plays. And I'm going to call those the risk time zones. The first time zone I'll call the emerging risk time zone. This is when a risk is remote. You don't have much exposure yet, and it's not even clear the risk is real. Many risk managers have some version of this running in the background. It often feels like a waste of time. But if you ignore it, sooner or later, a risk is going to come up and surprise you, and that didn't have to happen. The play here is simple. Notice accelerating change in remote risks early. The second time zone I'll call the moderate time zone. This is the normal times. Your risk register is relatively stable year to year. Your loss distributions are well understood, and the standard toolkit of identification, measurement, mitigation, and capital budgeting works as desired. The zone has dominated the past 50 years, though I'd argue it may not be where we are right now. The third zone is the boom time zone. When markets are rising, when prices are up and losses are low, the normal risk discipline feels like a drag on growth. And in a boom, risk management will simply be ignored unless it adapts. The important role in a boom isn't controlling everything. It's watching to make sure that growth doesn't push the firm past its aggregate risk-carrying capacity. The play is, don't let success lead to fragility. The fourth time zone is the bust time zone. Booms are often overshot, and when sentiment shifts, it can shift fast. This is the time zone where risk management has a chance to prove it's more than a governance function. A good CRO can call audibles here, stop the bleeding, protect the core, and help the organization absorb and survive the hit. The fifth time zone I'll call the post-mortem time zone. If your firm has just been through a major loss event, how you learn from it matters enormously. The school of hard knocks is the most expensive way to learn. And a lot of firms either skip the real postmortem or turn it into a blame exercise. The right play is learning without blame and without hindsight bias, which is harder than it sounds. The sixth time zone is the VUCA time zone. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We've talked about those a lot. This is often right before a boom or right after a bust, when no one can tell which direction things are heading. Standard risk management breaks down in this zone because the underlying distributions just aren't stable. The play here is to maximize flexibility while still executing on your core strategy. 6 zones, 6 plays. The program that can recognize which zone it's in and shift its approach accordingly is far more valuable than one that just runs the same playbook regardless of the conditions. That's my core idea for today.
Dave, that's fascinating. I'm really looking forward to diving into this topic. You used the football playbook analogy to open up. What was the intuition behind that framing? What were you trying to say about how ERM programs actually function?
It's interesting, Max, because I certainly was somebody that fell into the category of folks who thought there was one playbook and you ought to stay to it. I even wrote a blog that said, a good ERM program needs discipline. It needs to stick to the program in good times and bad. But when I reflected on that idea in the current times we're in, and we said this a couple times recently, VUCA, I realized that the ERM program needs to be expanded. It needs to be more like that football playbook, with a wide variety of plays for a wide variety of situations. That crazy trick play that's my favorite, the Philly special that the Eagles used in the Super Bowl, was actually in their playbook. They weren't going off playbook even for that outrageous play, where the quarterback caught the one and only time that a quarterback caught a touchdown pass in a Super Bowl. That's what an ERM program needs. It needs some different plays in it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember that play. The central claim of risk time zones seems to be that ERM programs are too locked into one mode, the moderate zone playbook. How widespread do you think that problem actually is? Is this a design flaw or just how organizations naturally gravitate?
I think it's a design intention, actually. The most recent ERM framework document that I reviewed for somebody was exactly that. It contained a sort of get out of jail free card type of rule in it. It explicitly gave the board freedom to waive the rules when there was a special situation. That's one way to deal with that narrow playbook problem. I think it's even better, though, to put those extra plays into the playbook. One of the zones, Max, the first one I mentioned was the emerging risk zone. And in that zone, we ask managers to pay attention to things that may not even be real risks yet. What does noticing accelerating change look like in practice? What habits or structures do you think support that?
Yeah, I look at this from two different perspectives, being early and considering interactions between risks. Emerging risk can be something new or that hasn't happened for a long time or something that evolves. Examples would include the impact on life and health insurance from the changes in vaccination policy with the government, new regulation on calculating reserves, or aggressive practices by insurers in their investment portfolios. Cyber has been evolving for several decades now. Remember when our inboxes were full of spam every morning? Certainly a lot bigger risk than that today, but I remember that was really inconvenient. Sometimes these risks require us to think many years into the future, as the signal is currently weak. Proactive scanning. I used to ask risk managers in my emerging risk survey what they reviewed to help them find these needles in a haystack. There are many publications from insurance organizations and consulting firms, but I always find it useful to listen to history podcasts and read National Geographic and magazines like that, in addition to financial and insurance magazines. Interactions are harder. I don't think everyone has this skill, and no one person recognizes all the interactions. Examples would include geopolitical conflicts over fresh water supplies as snowpack decreases due to climate change, or terrorist acts to infrastructure due to immigration policy. And of course, demographics is a force multiplier across everything. Environmental scanning needs to be very active right now. Stability is fading on several fronts, and rules of thumb tied to geopolitical, financial, or environmental risks should be challenged. I've said this before, but we need to work from first principles and understand the drivers of cascading outcomes. Insurer bankruptcy risk includes guarantee assessments for surviving firms, something we haven't considered before. Postmortems are great, especially if they cover another firm's mistakes. But a premortem where we look for what could go wrong before approving initiatives and then follow up to learn from our mistakes makes a lot of sense to me. This can be part of a scenario planning exercise. I've always done that with my annual predictions. I post them in January and review in December, adding but never subtracting from the comments I originally made. Dave, the boom zone argument cuts against intuition a bit. You're saying that risk management's role in a boom is not necessarily to pump the brakes, but to watch aggregate capacity. Can you walk through what that looks like in insurance context specifically?
Sure, Max. In my mind, the risk management program does need to carry on as usual, but needs to think about adjusting how it deals with individual risk limits. And that could be something that it forces into a general discussion, or it can be something that just an operating procedure within the risk management function. The CRO needs to keep mentioning the concept that the company needs to grow when growth is easy. Because if you look back over long running corporations, the ones that survive in the long run do take advantage of good times to grow, because it's very hard to grow any other time. But they can't grow without limit, so they have to pick their spots. The CRO has to encourage management to decide exactly where they want to grow. If the company has been utilizing all of its available capital before the boom, and they're running with the aggregate risk closer to their tolerance, then the CRO needs to work real closely with the CFO from the start to make sure that the company has plans to tap into additional sources of capital, or maybe that they use methods to release capital that is tied up in stagnant parts of the business.
Yeah, looking at capacity, that's a really good idea. But I think you also need to look at the risk exposure levels that can lead to insolvency, and then hedge based on the firm's risk appetite. I think it's just a slightly different twist on what you're saying. As you've always said, Dave, risk grows in the dark, and it's easy to become complacent. You mentioned that in a boom, risk management may simply be ignored unless it gets with the program. Is there a version of this where the CRO's credibility in the bust depends on how they behaved in the boom?
That's a great question. I haven't seen a large number of CROs who have actually lasted through all phases of the market cycle. So I can't give a statistically credible response to that. But there are cycles for individual risks going on all the time that don't necessarily coincide with the major cycles. So the credibility of the CRO is being tested all of the time. I think both the boom and the bust are very trying for the CRO for different reasons. At our current macro stage, the uncertain phase has its own special twist because the business literature has generally not recognized this well in the past. I think that in many companies, management will drift towards the best strategy for each part of the cycle. So the CRO needs to have an idea in mind of what their role is in each part of the cycle for each risk.
That's interesting, Dave. You used the word audible for the bust zone, suggesting the CRO needs to call a play at the line in real time. What does that require organizationally? Is this something that can be pre-planned, or is it fundamentally improvisational?
Not exactly pre-planned, but it needs to be stated somehow in the ERM framework, stated the amount of authority that the CRO has to make mid-course adjustments to the ERM program. Otherwise, everything just becomes an ad hoc decision.
Yeah, that makes sense. Learning without blame or hindsight bias. That's easy to say and hard to do. What makes a postmortem genuinely useful rather than just performative?
I I recall one company that we heard from when I was working at S&P right after a major hurricane. They said their claims were 25% higher than what their model told them to expect, and then detailed how they were recalibrating their model. They had gone through that post-mortem exercise and narrowed it down really finely to where their decision making went wrong. All I could tell was they valued getting it right and were realistic about the fact that they could never be perfect about that. I guess they felt they were mostly right, so those corrections were a positive thing.
Yeah, it's so hard to look forward and avoid blame. I would use an analogy using my investment style, which creates a quantitative intrinsic value based entirely on future metrics. And then history can be useful qualitatively. When I'm looking at a company, I'll avoid the stock if the firm's culture, for example, is poor or unclear. So there's still a way to get both qualitative and quantitative in. Dave, you say standard economics does not even admit the fuga zone exists. Say more about that, because it seems like an important point buried inside a practical article.
Well, we actually have to distinguish between business and market analysis, practice, and the actual economics literature. In practice, most economists and most firms, like many actuaries, believe they can capture all important possibilities within a statistical model. Knightian uncertainty has been converted to risk, and therefore, in my thinking, it disappears. In fact, the economics literature, mostly literature from before the time of computer models, treats uncertainty very much like the pragmatist risk managers that we've talked about recently, something that triggers a more resilience-focused approach. So my statement about that was a little bit oversimplified.
Well, that's another reason to look at historical articles about things that were done 100 years ago or more. A lot of times we can learn from that in today's environment as well. Dave, one thing listeners may wonder is, how do you know which zone you're in? Can organizations misread the zone? And what are the failure modes of that misreading?
Well, Max, the full answer to that question is quite long, a couple hours at least. But I can give you a moderately long, short answer to that. And it's easiest to do that using examples. So for the emerging risk time zone, it's a period of accelerating change. The best current example is artificial intelligence. Things are changing really fast for that. A couple years ago, you might have called that an emerging risk. Probably don't call it that anymore. It's probably right there on your risk register. Cyber risk was the poster child for this for a number of years. When something is new that's causing a lot of stir. The moderate time zone is pretty clearly in place when your risk register is the same from one year to the next, and your risk model only needs minimal recalibration from one year to the next. The boom time also isn't hard to spot. Something or maybe several things are suddenly hot in the market. They seem like easy wins, and the talk is that you need to get on board or miss out. Maybe FOMO, fear of missing out, is the key indicator of a boom. Bust is even easier to spot. Losses are piling up and everybody's running for the exit at the same time. Post-mortem time is, of course, right after the bust, but it needs to be after the dust is settled, but before people start rewriting their memories to paper over the things that can be learned. VUCA time is the hardest to spot since it requires a very different strategy than any other time zones. It's very important to identify it, though. When VUCA time is first arriving, you are constantly being surprised. Things are just not working like you would expect. People and businesses start to get gun shy. Perhaps a potential partner backs out for no apparent reason, or some project fails to achieve the rewards that were expected.
That's really interesting, Dave, but let's take it back to a practical standpoint to wrap up. For a CRO listening to this who wants to take the framework back to their team, where would you start? Is this a strategic planning conversation, a board conversation, a risk committee conversation, or something else?
I think that first it's a risk committee conversation. The best time to have it is after a transition from one time zone to another. At that time, it's easier to point out what would have been smoother to do because the ERM framework anticipated it. Then you can have the conversation of what exactly are the type of different plays for the different environments. And exactly how to work that flexibility into the ERM governance system depends on how decisions are made in general at the company. And then it might become an executive management discussion or a board discussion, but you need to work it through with the risk committee first.
Risk time zones is a topic that we'll be diving into more deeply. For now, hopefully we've whet your appetite and opened you to the idea that CROs have an impossible job as they maneuver through various phases of a cycle, and hopefully we can provide some tools that help the CROs move through that cycle. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.